Part 1 of turning my 1980 Chevy LUV from this into this. First things first, we gotta give this thing a bath. So we roll out the Harbor Freight Special pressure washer, hook it all up, turn that baby on, and get to rinsing. This thing has years of baked on moss, dirt, and grime. And after what seemed like literally hours of rinsing, we're on to my favorite part. The good old foam cannon. Hell yeah, brother. I have no idea what it is about this thing, but it is so satisfying to use. I mean, just look at that. And then a ton of scrubbing. The paint on this thing was filthy. I literally ruined this cheap wash mitt. I mean, just look at this water, yuck. Then on to one final rinse, and ta-da! Well, it's definitely not perfect, but it's a huge improvement. And now, it'll be a clean eyesore for my neighbors to look at. Thanks guys for watching. Don't forget to follow and check out the merch link in my bio. The wash job from my last video turned out great, but now it's time to turn our attention to the interior. So it's time to glove up and get the vacuum out. The first step of this process is to remove all the junk and clutter from the interior, and that includes everything under the bench seat, so it's got to come out. Not to mention the standard bench seat's going to be replaced with racing seats later on. So after removing 4 12mm nuts, the bench seat comes right out. And just look at all that junk that was hiding under there. After removing the big stuff, we vacuumed it up, and now we can remove this nasty carpet. But I wasn't super glad about what was underneath. Yeah, that's rust. I mean, good news is now there's floor ventilation, and finally I vacuumed up all the rust scale off of what was left of the floor pan. And that's a job done. It's already starting to look like a NASCAR truck. Next thing we gotta do is make room for the new transmission, so that means out with the old. The first order of business here is jacking the truck up and putting it on jack stands so we have more room under the truck. First thing that we gotta remove is the shifter. It's just 2 12mm bolts and it comes right out. And next is the drive line. This one's just 4 more bolts and nuts, and then it drops down, and then it slides right out. I almost forgot to drain the trans oil, and let me tell you guys, this stuff was gooey. Since I already had the engine out, just 3 more bolts for the trans mount, and then while supporting the front of the trans, I pulled out the back and just set it down on the ground. Well, it kind of fell. And I'll tell you what, this was a pretty light transmission. Now with the trans out of the way, I just decided to cut out the rest of the exhaust, since we won't be needing it. And now in the next video, I think we're going to be cleaning up this engine bay. So what I did today was remove unnecessary items from the engine bay, such as this old bungee cord, to make room for the new 5.3 LM7. So I started off by removing all these dry rotted rubber hoses that won't be used with the new engine. I then removed all the small detachable wiring harnesses that connected to the old engine's electronics, since we'll no longer be using them. That means this coil has got to go. And don't worry, I'm saving all these old parts in case somebody needs them. So after removing all 3 wires and the 2 mounting screws, it comes right out. I then removed the parking brake cable and lever assembly, since I probably won't be using this in the future anyways. And lastly, I removed the clutch cable and the clutch pedal, since the truck's going to be an automatic, because automatics are faster. Now, I definitely didn't get everything that I wanted to done today, but that's okay, because the weekend just started. First thing we're doing today is draining this bad gas. We got to remove that line and the positive terminal for the stock fuel pump. And the ground is actually just hooked here to the frame. So I grabbed some jumper cables, a spare battery, and a bucket. Then slid it under to catch all that stale dyno juice, pulled off the soft line, and hooked up the jumper cables to the negative and positive of the stock fuel pump. Then up to my battery. At first the pump was barely dribbling fuel out, but then it caught a second wind and started putting out like your mother on Sunday after church. And after it was all empty, I poured what looked like dehydrated old man urine into a suitable container. I then did some deadlifts with the truck, and decided it was time to take off the topper. It was just 6 really hard to get 2 bolts. I had to get fairly creative to loosen them all by myself. And once all 6 bolts were removed, I literally had to peel the topper off. And finally, I He-Manned it off by myself. So in part 2, we stripped the interior. Well, I missed a couple things, but we're gonna take care of that right now. I started off with the door panels by removing the window crank, door handle bezels, and the door pull. And after a couple hidden screws on the bottom, it just pops right off. I also ground down some sharp edges. I then removed the sill plates and the ugly blue molding, and then went on to remove the old crusty dash. This thing literally broke out in chunks. I also had to remove the glove box so that I didn't break it taking the rest of the dash off. I then reinstalled it, and look how that closes. Of course, wouldn't be complete without a nasty love sticker, merch link in bio. And then these ugly blue kick panels. I then had to take off the visors, and this crumbly little light, it literally fell apart. And lastly, these thingies. And then finish it off by cutting out the headliner. And now the very last order of business was to remove all these seat belts, because who needs those, right? It's really starting to look like a NASCAR truck. So next thing on the to-do list is to get rid of some of this rust and coat the floors. I got all my PPE on, and it's time to start wire brushing with the drill. I wire brushed most of the floor to prepare the surface for rust encapsulator. The wire brush also helped to get rid of a bunch of stuck on dirt and grime. And then my drill died, so then I guess I was done with the wire wheel. I then vacuumed the whole floor, blew all the dust out with compressed air, and then vacuumed one more time. Next I sprayed the entire floor with wax and grease remover, agitated it, and then wiped it off with a rag. Prepping the surface like this is a very vital step so that the rust encapsulator has something to stick to. I blew it out one more time, then filled my spray gun with the rust encapsulator. I then laid it down on the rusty areas. And this stuff takes 48 hours to cure before it can be painted. And while that started to cure, I sprayed the back half of the truck with a different type of rust encapsulator. And in 48 hours, we'll be able to paint this bad boy. Thank you everyone for watching, and stay tuned for part 8. Let's get started. We're going to clean out this engine bay and finish up the floors from the last video. I got out the pressure washer and it's time to get rinsing. I then broke out the uber satisfying foam cannon and started scrubbing. And I even hopped in the engine bay. After a lot of degreaser and scrubbing, it started to come off. And getting all the grease off this belly pan was super satisfying. And here's what it looks like after. A huge improvement. So I turned my attention inside the cab where I wiped it all down with a tack cloth. I coated the rust treatment with a rust sealer. And guess what everyone, I'm going to start buying parts for the build on Monday. I'm going to start off with buying the Ford 9-inch and then the engine swap mount kit. Now back to your program. I finished off the floor pan with a white Rust-Oleum paint. Didn't turn out perfect, but I'm very happy with it. Thanks guys for watching and stay tuned for part 9. We might start adding parts. Today I decided to remove the rear bumper and spare tire. As it turns out, a 3/8 extension works great for lowering the spare tire on my LUV. And now that the tire is off, we can remove the spare tire carrier. It's just 4 easy to get to bolts, and luckily they weren't rusted at all. Although I can't really say the same for the ones holding on the bumper, because I broke one, and then another. One more bolt, and now the left side of the bumper is free. And now onto the right side where I broke yet another bolt. And after some choice swear words, I was able to get this last bolt out and then wiggle the bumper off. And now it's looking good, except for that dent. Me being the expert body man I am, I hammered it out. And that's the job done. Thanks for watching. Don't forget about extended version videos on my YouTube channel, and stay tuned for part 10. So while we're waiting on parts in the mail, I decided to tear apart the engine for the LUV. I started with the accessory drive, which was actually very simple, and then the intake and coil packs. I then took off the driver's side header, valve cover, and then the rocker arm assembly. Then I moved over to the passenger side and did the exact same process. I also made sure to lay out all my parts side per side so it doesn't get mixed up. Then I removed the knock sensors and valley pan, followed by all the cylinder head bolts. I then removed the cylinder head to confirm this is in fact a 5.3. Pulled the lifters, driver's side cylinder head, and now we're left with a short block. But we're not done yet. I want to see how those rod bearings look. So we flipped it over, took off the oil pan, the windage tray, and the pickup tube. And I even found a cut up O-ring inside the oil pump. Luckily it was never ran like this. I removed the pistons, rods, and bearings, and the rods and bearings were in great condition. So that's a job done. Thanks guys for watching. Don't forget to check out my Instagram and YouTube, link in bio, and stay tuned for part 11. So we're going to pick up where we left off last time and tear this down the rest of the way. Also, I got my engine mounts in, which I'm super excited about. But before we get started, I need to go on a little side mission and pick up some tools. So I went to the local coffee shop and got not coffee, made a quick delivery.
There you go.
And then we stopped into my favorite store in the entire world. I grabbed a warranty replacement, and then this badass hydraulic puller, and then of course a couple other things that I definitely didn't need. So back at home, I moved the engine out into the sunlight. And then struggled for about 15 minutes to get this pulley off, but eventually it just pops right off. With the pulley out of the way, we have access to the timing cover and then the oil pump. Then we can go ahead and remove the cam sprocket and timing chain, followed by the cam retainer. I then threaded 2 bolts in the end of the camshaft so that we could pull it out easier. And while being careful not to damage anything, it came right out. Next, I removed the cam position sensor and the oil pressure sending unit. Then I worked on pulling off the rear main seal housing, which I couldn't get all the way out with the engine stand in the way, but it'll come out when the crank comes out. and then flipped over the engine to get better access to the main caps, where I removed all the side bolts and top bolts holding on the main caps. I then actually had to use a pry bar very gently to pry these caps out because they were a little bit stuck. And after that, the crankshaft came right out. And then lastly, I removed all the main bearings, followed by the crankshaft position sensor. And now we are left with a completely bare block, and it's ready to go through the parts washer. In the last video, we tore this block down. Now it's time to give it a hone and a bath. But first, off to Harbor Freight. After a little pull, we arrived in heaven, where I picked up a new stone hone. Now back at the house, it was time to start honing, so we lubed up the cylinders and got at it. It took a bit to get the correct technique, but I think this here was the key. After the hone, we wiped out the cylinders and repeated the same process to the other side, and that's a hone job done. I then enlisted the help of my girlfriend's brother to get the block in the back of my truck, which was a little bit of a struggle. I then boxed up the rest of the dirty parts and put them all in the back of the truck to be washed. Now being the next day, we're off to my work. I brought the block inside and cleaned off all the gasket mating surfaces before putting the block in the parts washer. It's better to scrape the gasket surfaces now because all the leftover debris will get washed off in the parts washer. With the help of a coworker, we heaved it into the washer. And while that was doing its thing, I cleaned up all the other parts in the solvent tank. Now just look at how clean that block is. And after struggling to get this thing out, I blew it all off with some compressed air. And afterwards, I double cleaned every cylinder with brake clean and oiled it all up so that it doesn't rust. And just look at that block. Now it's almost ready for paint and reassembly, but only after I order a bunch of parts from Texas Speed. Recently I found water's been getting onto the passenger floorboard, and I suspect it's due to a large buildup of debris under this cowl. I'm also going to try to clean up the dash as best as possible without glue gun. So we grabbed our freshly cleaned tools thanks to Tovo towels. Then we headed out to the truck to remove these wipers and the 4 screws that hold the cowl on. And I have a pretty good feeling there's going to be a lot of gunk under here. So we removed the left wiper arm nut and then the right side. And then popped off the left wiper arm and the right. And then next it was 4 screws, and I'm surprised none of these were seized. Then off with the cowl, and look at that. Just as I had suspected, this thing is completely full of gunk. So I broke out the trusty shop vac and vacuumed up a bunch of the loose debris, and I wasn't able to get all of it, and that's why I had to remove these screens. And with those out of the way, I was able to vacuum up a lot more debris. I then repeated the same steps to the other side. And then finally, I blew it all out with compressed air. Now, I'm not positive this is going to solve my water intrusion issue, but just look at how clean that cowl is now. Then we started to reassemble. I put the screens back on, followed by the cowl, and then the screws that hold it in place. And then next I put both of the wiper arms back on. And now that that's done, it's on to our next task. But before cleaning up the dash, I thought I'd remove this water stain. I put down some baking soda and then scrubbed the whole thing with Tovo towels, and it actually did a really good job. And now I was on to cleaning up the dash. Now my goal here was just to remove loose dirt. But surprisingly, the Tovo towels actually removed a lot of the old dried-on dash adhesive. And I think if I had spent enough time, I could have removed all of it just with Tovo towels. But I was pretty happy with the result. Since we're still waiting on parts, we're going to paint the 9-inch axle housing. After getting the housing up off the ground, I flipped it over. I then taped off the hole where the center section goes and the ends of the axle housing tubes. Next, it was time to clean this thing up with some wax and grease remover. After it was clean and dry, I hit it with a tack cloth to try to get rid of any lint. Then I mixed the Rust-Oleum bare metal primer. And it was time to start spraying. I started off with this small gun, but the tip was too small, so I moved over to my larger gun. After a few coats, I was satisfied with the finish, and it was time for paint. For the top coat, I'm using flat black Rust-Oleum with a little bit of hardener. And I am by no means a professional painter, but I'm actually really happy with how this stuff laid out. After a couple heavy coats, this is how it laid out. I'm actually very satisfied with the final product, and I honestly didn't expect it to look this good. I just wanted to apologize for the lack of content recently. Every single part that I have ordered is still on back order, but I promise we'll get moving here pretty soon. Thanks guys for watching. Check out my Instagram and YouTube link in the bio, and stay tuned for part 15.
Today we're going to be building the axle assembly. To start out today I had to move all these boxes and get everything set up before I could start work. I laid out some microfibers to prevent scratches, pulled out the axle housing, and got straight to work removing slag from the inside of the housing. After I was satisfied with the cleanliness, I started installing these studs which hold the third member to the housing. And that took forever. Afterwards I cleaned up the mating surfaces to prepare for silicone application, and once everything was clean, I broke out the 3-bond and started gooping. I made sure to lay a really thick bead because we definitely don't want this to leak. Next I picked up the very heavy third member and installed it, making sure to tighten every nut to the torque spec of Guten tight. And I never thought I'd say this, but that is sexy looking. It is one fine looking third member. Moving on, now it was time to get the axles installed. And first I had to put in the axle seals. And I didn't do a great job installing this side. It was a little bit mangled, but I lubed it up, applied some silicone to the bearing race, and then very slowly and seductively slid the axle into the axle housing. I gave it a couple love taps with the rubber mallet, and it was installed. And then finally I put on the retainer plate. I then repeated the same process on the other side, but installed this seal without absolutely destroying it, put the axle in, the retainer plate on, and that thing was ready for brakes. And it's really starting to look like an axle assembly now. Up next, I started to install the caliper brackets. As the name implies, this is where the caliper bolts to. I installed one on the other side, and again made sure to tighten them to the Guten tight torque spec. And now we were ready for rotors, which were interesting to install since they were multi-lug rotors, something that I have never seen before. But after figuring out one side, the other side just slid right on. And just like that, we were ready for calipers. I installed them, ensuring that the bleeder was facing upwards, and cinched it down with my electric ratchet. Then did the same exact thing to the other side. And after the last caliper pin was tight, that means that this job is now done. And it looks awesome. I can't wait to throw this thing in the truck.
So before I get started, there's a little wasp problem I have to take care of. And in case you didn't know, brake parts cleaner works great for this.
Oh, geez.
I still feared for my life though, but now our pest problem is solved. And it's time to get to the real work. Today we're removing this old gas tank and putting in our new fuel cell. Also, be sure to check out my YouTube A to Z performance. I just posted a 14-minute version of this video. With that being said, let's get to work. I started by jacking up the truck and lowering it on a jack stance, and yes, I did a shake test. Now with the truck at a good working height, I cut off the fuel filler neck and all the evap hoses.
Why would you take the lines off when you can just cut them?
And after that word from our sponsor, I cut some lines under the truck. I then disconnected the stock fuel sending unit. And now it was time to get at the 6 bolts holding this tank on. I then grabbed one of the greatest tools known to man, a red Milwaukee Impact, and took off the bolts on one side, followed by the other side. Now with all the bolts out, the tank was free and I was able to wiggle it out. And of course there was still one hose that I had missed that I had to cut, and it was out. Look at all this room for activities. We could do aerobics in here. While I was under there, I even did a little more weight reduction and got rid of a bunch of junk. So I removed both side jack stands and lowered the truck down. I then measured the tank and then moved those measurements over to the bed of the truck and got to cutting. I had to cut this out so that the fuel cell would sit flush on the bed of the truck, and obviously so that we can run our fuel lines to the front of the truck. After my air compressor ran out of steam, I had to finish off the cuts with a Sawzall. And then look, we have a hole in the bottom of the truck. I put the fuel cell down so that I could mark for holes to drill, and you guessed it, I got right to drilling. And then after drilling 2 incorrect holes and having to re-drill them, I put the fuel cell back on, put all the bolts in, and then I went underneath of the truck, installed the lock washers and nuts, and cranked them down way too tight, because as you can see here, it bent the mounts on my fuel cell, which I was not happy about. Lesson learned here, I should have taken my time and went and got some spacers. But anyways, the fuel cell is installed and it is very solid. I will likely end up going back and fixing this, but for the time being, we have a fuel cell installed in the truck. Which that in itself makes me very happy, because that is the first actual part installed on the Nasty Love build. So up on the docket for today is the first real big install, the Aerospace Components front brake kit. It's so beautiful. Anyways, we had to jack up the truck, and I forgot to record jacking up the front, which doesn't really matter. And then I started taking off the front wheels.
Also be sure to check out my YouTube channel, A to Z Performance. I just posted a 9-minute version of this exact video. Moving forward, I sucked the brake fluid out of each reservoir, and it was nasty. I then went to each caliper and each wheel cylinder and drained them of all their fluid. This stuff was literally brown, probably from rust. Next, it was time to remove the calipers themselves. First by removing the brake line from the caliper and then from the body of the truck itself. I then unbolted the caliper and pulled it right off. Surprisingly enough, none of these fasteners were seized and they all actually came out really easily. Next, off with the dust cap, then the spindle nut, and the hub assembly slides right off. I then removed the backing plate with 4 easy bolts, and then cleaned up some of the rust off of this mating surface, so that our new bracket would slide right on and sit flush. I then tightened that down, and then it was time to pack some wheel bearings. And next, it's your Turbo Towels grime time. Today, with the awesome power of Turbo Towels, I cleaned off the spindle before putting on the new brakes, and these things do great at removing grease and grime. I'm not even kidding when I say I use these things everywhere. Anyways, it is now time to slide on that gorgeous hub assembly, followed by the spindle nut, which was tightened until there was slight drag on the rotor, and I cleaned the rotor off and installed the new brake pads. And with the new brake pads being installed, that means this install is now done. I was not able to put the braided lines on today because I did need an adapter, but we'll handle that in a later video. But that is all I got for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to follow because you're not going to want to miss this truck come together, and I can promise you it is going to happen fast. I mean, just look at this beautiful brake kit. Today on the docket, we are finally installing the Quick Performance Ford 9-inch rear end. And just a heads up, I just posted a 9-minute version of this video, which is way funnier, and you can find it on my YouTube channel, A to Z Performance. The link is in my bio. To start off this swap, I had to remove this 3-way junction brake line, which I'm probably going to end up reusing. And up next were these completely blown out shocks, which actually came out really easy. Up next, I tackled both of the driver's side U-bolts, which surprisingly came off really easy. Then the shock mounting plate slid right off, and it was on to the other side. Now with the passenger side also released, this axle assembly was ready to come right out. And if you watch the full version on my YouTube, you'll actually see that we caught a little bit of a snag right here. But now with the old assembly out, it was time for the new. And I tell you what, this Quick Performance rear end is one bad unit, and I can guarantee it will hold up to all the power that we throw at it, and look good doing so. After we wiggled it into place, it was time to put all the new U-bolts on, and the old shock mounts back on. And then it was on to the very slow and very painful process of tightening down every single one of these nuts. I wish I had a way to cut these, but I did not at the time, so it took forever to put all these on and tighten them all down. But once they were all tight, boy, look at that. That is a Quick Performance Ford 9-inch in a 1980 Chevy LUV. This makes me super excited because we are really making some good progress on the build, and I can't wait to get this thing on the road. So today we are going to install a ton of parts on the truck, and I just uploaded a 27-minute version of this video on my YouTube channel. Also, I just changed my YouTube channel name to Autotech Aaron, the same as it is here on TikTok. But without further ado, let's get to working.
So we're just going to find the center point of this hole, punch it, and then drill it out.
And drill it out I did.
Now that we got that hole drilled out, we got to just drill 2 more holes and we can install our clutch pedal assembly.
Once the holes were drilled, I sanded this down and painted it.
While that paint dries, we're going to remove this stock gas pedal so we can put in the aftermarket one for the drive-by wire. All we have to do is remove that cotter pin right there. This pin slides out and the whole pedal assembly comes off.
So after removing the factory gas pedal, I set the new one up in there and found that I need to cut these tabs off. So I did exactly that and I cut them off. And now after I finished hacking the truck to pieces, it was time to mount the pedal. Which proves to be fairly difficult when you're by yourself because there's nobody to hold the wrench on the other side. But anyways, now the pedal is installed.
Time to finish up that clutch pedal install.
So I installed the pedal assembly and then went to the other side and put the master cylinder on, followed by the washers and locking nuts, and then I tightened those down and we were almost done. I just had to put on this last bracket right here and then put on the foot pad just like that, and now we have a fully installed clutch pedal assembly.
Here we have our new master cylinder. We're going to put it on the truck and bend the lines before bench bleeding this.
And I did bend those lines. I bent them real good.
And there we have it, 2 freshly made brake lines. We're going to take this back off, bench bleed it, reinstall it, and then we're gonna work on the rear brakes.
And after it was bled, we reinstalled the master cylinder for the last time. I also made new rear lines, but you can only find that in my YouTube video version. And then I got to bleeding the rear brakes, which actually went over really well. With the rears properly bled, I went up to the front right and then the front left and bled both of them as well. And with them all bled, that means these brakes are completed. Here's the old master cylinder and the brake booster before I cleaned it up. And look at that, the new master cylinder on my refreshed brake booster, it looks awesome. And that just about does it for today's video. We got all these pedals installed. We now have working brakes and I'm super excited. This build is really coming along nicely.
So after moving my Legacy out, I gotta move this thing over here just like there we go. It is now in the middle of the garage. Let's get to work. So I want to try to get rid of some of these holes in the floor here because my heel just goes right through that. As you can see, you can probably already tell what the idea here is. So let's go ahead and cut out some of that rot and then panel bond and rivet these in. So we're going to start out by cutting out some of this metal just like that. There we go. Let's get all this cleaned up and ready for the seal bond. There we go. We got both the holes cut out. We got some plates here. We're going to bend them up just like that to fit in there. Just like that, we have them bent up, laid down, a couple holes drilled. Now we're gonna clean all this up with some wax and grease remover, put the seal bond on, and then rivet them in. And just like that, there it is. I'm gonna put on some primer, and then I'm gonna put on some undercoating. And there we go, all painted and undercoated. And I am super happy with how this turned out. I was so happy I even decided to do the door panels in the truck. Thank you guys for watching. Be sure to check out my YouTube channel at Autotech Aaron. The link is in my bio. And guys, let's get to building Nasty Love.